A state-owned utility company, that's Eskom, continues being a tough pill to swallow for many. It is expected to dominate discussions at Wednesday's cabinet Lekgotla, with the latest saga being a pending tariff hike. To unpack the underlying matters driving the continuous requests by Eskom for tariff hikes and other issues within the state-owned entity, I'm now joined in the studio by the organization Undoing Tax Abuse, CEO Wayne Duvenage, on Skype, an energy expert, MD, and EE Publishers, Chris Yellend. Many thanks for making time to speak to us. Let me start with you. Just walk me through the increases, this tariff hikes. Just before we actually came on, you were just breaking it down for me. This is kind of a recurring event. You know, every other year there's another hike. Just walk me through whether or not this will ever come to an end.
Well, it has to, because they pushed the envelope too far. If you go back to the first multi-year price determinations in 2007, and you start seeing what kind of increases Eskom has had over the last decade, it's absurd. I mean, they go from a 39 or 40 billion rand income to close to 200 billion rand a year now. And on top of that, if you had have escalated or extrapolated just a CPI increase for energy users over that period, they've over-recovered or over-charged society about 500 billion rand. On top of that, they've gone and borrowed another 350 to 400 billion rand. So the debt has gone up, and you ask yourself, where's the 800 billion rand gone? You've got Medupi, Kusile, and Gula, all these very expensive, never-ending capital expenditure projects, the corruption that's taking place there, and the public have said enough. We cannot continue. And we believe that NERSA should have done a lot more, a lot sooner, going back at least 5 to 7 years, to stop this rampant increase that Eskom was allowed to achieve.
Let's take it over to Chris. A very pertinent point here raised. If you actually are to do the numbers, we're looking at over 500 billion rand from just the CPI implications here. And the pertinent question that's raised here is, where does this money go? Yes, Chris, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, of course, the expenses of Eskom seem to rise all the time. So, for example, over the last years, staff of Eskom has increased radically. Pay rises to Eskom staff have consistently exceeded inflation by a significant amount. And so salaries is the second biggest cost item in the income statement. The other big one, of course, is primary energy, coal. And the cost of coal has rocketed in Eskom's income statement. So these are the two major cost items on the expenses side. But in addition to that, of course, the interest bill has shot up because of the capital project and because of the downgrade of Eskom's credit rating. Eskom is paying a lot more for this debt than it would have done in the past. Interest on debt has also increased dramatically. And lastly, depreciation costs have increased dramatically over the last year or two, largely because the projects, Medupi and Kusile, projects that are coming on stream unit by unit, once they go into commercial service, the depreciation applies. So depreciation has shot up significantly, and all of this is having a major impact on Eskom's bottom line.
Right, Chris, strong points there that you raised, but let's move on to another person actually who is joining us for this particular conversation, NERSA's Brian Sechotlho, who's the acting executive manager over for electricity over at NERSA. This point when it comes to the hikes, do you actually have a stakeholder conversation, or is it just a hearing from Eskom and increase the tariffs? Just walk us through the process before many of these hikes are actually tabled.
Good afternoon. I'm glad to be here. Let me just explain the process that we follow when we receive Eskom's application. First of all, before they even come to us with our application, they are required by law to go to the National Treasury and saga to get comments on the applications. That is the first consultation that goes through. And then after that, having taken those comments into account, they then come to us with an application. first thing that we then do is publish the application for stakeholder comments written, but also we then embark on a nationwide public hearing process. As we speak right now, we are now in the Northwest Province, in Rustenburg. This is our third week of doing these public hearings, and then at the end of this week, then we'll be going to the Gauteng Province. Yes, there's been a number of presenters, and the presenters include Eskom, but notably we've had a lot of businesses, we've had civic associations, and we had individuals that came to give their comments. As it may be expected, obviously, Eskom would speak positively about their application and try to motivate for its increase. But then we've got other stakeholders, and most of them, if not all of them, have actually raised concerns about the rapid increases in electricity prices. Then after that, as NERSA will do our own analysis based on methodology that we developed that governs the multi-year price determination. And then we will also then take into account the stakeholder comments that have been given to us. But most of, at the end of it all also, we will then do a economic impact analysis and financial analysis of Eskom's financial position. Having taken all of that into account, we then expect to have an approval on the 1st of March this year, 2019.
Brian, very, very briefly, have you turned down an application before?
We have actually not turned it down, but adjusted an application. If you may recall, last year Eskom had come to us with a request for a 19% increase for this financial year. But then when you looked at it, our final decision was 5.23% instead of the 19% increase. And basically, mainly being that we viewed some of the Eskom's costs that they presented to us to having not been efficient and prudently incurred, and therefore we turned it down and only allowed 5.23% increase last year.
Right. Brian, thanks for that. Let me get back to the gentleman. Wayne, let me start with you. Later on, we'll actually cross to Chris. He actually says that they have turned down an application for a hike before.
Well, they've reduced the application. They haven't turned it down. But I think they needed to be stronger a lot earlier. And I'm going back now 7-8 years when those increases were extremely high. And what we saw was the primary energy costs go up well above inflation. And I know that was exacerbated by the gas turbines being used, but that was all a result of poor leadership and poor management. We have got coal contracts which are questionable, and if you just add the increases over and above CPI on primary energy costs, you're talking another 100 billion rand, about 96 billion rand according to our calculations. So yes, NERSA has done what they had to do anyway, but they hadn't been strong enough, earlier enough is what our concern is, and that's why we sit in this mess. I mean, which organization in the world can increase its revenue over a decade by 400% to 500% and not put any additional output from kilowatt hours or terawatt hours out there into the public or sales increases from a cost per unit point of view? I mean, a number of units point of view. So the productivity has dropped off tremendously. The staff has increased by about 15,000 staff, from just under 30,000 to over 40,000 staff. This is unacceptable, and you cannot. NERSA needed to hold them to account there. You can't increase your staff when your output doesn't increase. You can't increase your salaries to that extent. You cannot increase your primary energy costs to that extent. Harder, tougher questions needed to be put to Eskom to say, unless you turn this boat around earlier, we cannot ask you to pass these costs on to society. Now we're suffering. Businesses are closing. Energy costs are too high. And Eskom is now caught in a death spiral because people are removing themselves from the grid. We don't need Eskom anymore. Lots of developments going up, and this is their own problem that they're going to suffer with. And the other problem we've got is allowing this regulatory asset base to be increased. Right now, or last year, sitting at 750 odd billion, which is not the true asset value. And now Eskom comes and wants to increase that to 1.2 trillion rand. This is unacceptable. The value of their assets is way below that. We put it at not anything more than 400 billion.
A very fascinating conversation here. I'm even thinking we might not even have enough time for this. Chris, let me throw it back to you. We just heard from Brian saying, you know what, we've revised some of the motivations that have been put forward by Eskom Is this good enough? And the other question is, you've been very, very candid and strong on the implications of this hike when it comes to inflation and the consumer, how much pressure this will actually put on them. Just walk me through these 2 points that you've raised and have been very vocal about.
Yeah, look, I think the important thing to note is that at the moment, Eskom is trying to cover all its needs simply from the customer by putting up the price of electricity. And of course, there is a limit to how much the customer and the economy can bear. And we have reached that limit. In my view, the customer cannot be the solution to all Eskom's problems, and a lot of other stakeholders are going to have to come to the table, most particularly the shareholder. The shareholder's business is to capitalize the business. Government says it won't come to the table with an equity injection, which is really another word for a bailout. But in the end, I do believe that NERSA is not going to give Eskom all that it asks for, and the shortfall is going to have to come from other stakeholders, including the shareholder, including financiers who might need to refinance Eskom's debt, perhaps come in with better interest rates and better, longer repayment terms. It might even be something like the International Monetary Fund has to step in and refinance this debt. Customers, of course, will have to pay their part. Suppliers will have to pay their staff. Eskom staff are going to have to play their part by reducing salary increases and even through retrenchments. It is absolutely inevitable that the business has to be restructured and right-sized. So yes, all of these players are going to have to come to the table. It cannot simply be left to the customer because in the end, the customer's options is to move their business somewhere else, reduce demand from Eskom, and that puts Eskom into a utility death spiral, as Wayne has pointed out so clearly.
Let's throw over to Brian. Brian, you've heard the gentleman here hit some very strong points. I want to ask you 2 questions. On one hand, Wayne here is saying, if we want to go by assets, you might not be able to cross the 500 billion mark in terms of valuation. Wayne, I don't know if I'm getting this right. Yes. Brian, I want to throw this over to you. Is this a valuation that you do agree with? And the other is on, is it time to consider conditionalities when it comes to approving some of these things? Take, for instance, the World Bank making it very clear that Eskom has a staff that is maybe over and above what it needs by over 60%. Is it time to look at these conditionalities?
Yeah, let me just answer the question on the valuation, and maybe if you can repeat the other question that you had. But the valuation is actually required is because of the electricity pricing policy, which says that the Eskom's assets need to be reevaluated with every application that they receive. Obviously, Eskom would then go out and do their evaluation, but once they've done the revaluation, we then have to test that revaluation as to whether or not it is applied on proper principles. And if we don't agree with them, then obviously we still can cut that revaluation. As it was with the MYPD3, just to take you back, Eskom had revalued their assets, and they had a figure of about 700 billion. But then we looked at it, and then we cut out of that, we cut 325 billion. So that's the difference that we had with Eskom on their own revaluation. The similar process will be followed with this one. Eskom is presenting 1.2 or 1.3 trillion in terms of their asset worth. But then we will look at that and then make a determination and to say then, is it or is it not? And the revaluation, I mean the asset value is because one of the new capacity building programs that they had, and also through the revaluation. But also on the capacity building programs, we will then look at it and say, has Eskom been prudent in terms of their building? And we'll need to understand why it took Eskom so long to complete their build programs. And if it is not convincing to us that the project were properly managed, then we will still cut the revaluated or the asset value to what we as NERSA determines to be the right value of the asset.
Brian,
so
I'm not going to
1.3 is not a final number, but it's still a number still to be reviewed by NERSA.
Brian, I'm going to have the gentlemen have their parting shots because we're actually running out of time. The last question I want to throw to everyone is on the subsidies. Let me start with you, Wayne. There's a lot of debate on whether or not it is time to actually do away with some of the subsidies. Take, for instance, close to 65 to 70% of Soweto does not actually pay for the electricity dues, as opposed to someone who might be in the rurals of Northern Cape who actually does have to pay for the electricity. Is this something that should be actually done away with? Let this be the parting shot. We'll hear from you, then cross over to Chris, then part over with Brian.
Look, the whole subsidy matter needs to be relooked at. I think there's a history there. We've got to undo that and try and get equity into equitable tariff charging where it is required. But there's no doubt about it that indigent communities and poorer communities are going to be subsidized more, or pay a little bit less than others. But we have some big concerns around subsidies to big business. Yeah. And that's the one issue we have. So we need to relook at all the subsidies, but we also need to relook at how Eskom can recover its money from defaulting municipalities. And that's a big issue that our government is going to have to bail them out because of the lack of prudent management in government and allowing politics to meddle in these state-owned institutions.
Strong points there. Let's have Chris from you very briefly.
Look, I think one has to distinguish between subsidies and theft and non-payment of electricity. In South Africa, we do have a subsidy system. It's known as free basic electricity, and indigent people qualify for free basic electricity. What we're seeing in Soweto has got nothing to do with subsidies. It's got to do with theft and a non-payment of electricity. It's a serious problem. More than 85% of all electricity supplied into Soweto is not paid for. It is stolen, and this is a problem. It's not the biggest problem that Eskom faces, but it's a very significant problem. Municipal debt and Soweto debt, money owed to Eskom at the moment is at 34 billion rands, and at some point Eskom is going to have to write off this debt as uncollectible, and that's going to have a massive impact on their bottom line.
Wow, I don't know if maybe that should have been the parting shot. Brian, very briefly, just tell me about the problem here with theft, as Chris actually puts it.
There's a problem of theft, and obviously it results in some kind of cross-subsidy. I don't know whether we want to call it cross-subsidy, but it is a cross-subsidy. But then there is also there are two other subsidies that we need to mention. The one is the subsidy from government outside of the tariff, and the other one is what we call the cross-subsidy, which is a tariff within the tariff, a subsidy within the tariff, whereby the maybe big customers, the larger customers pay more for their electricity because based on their cost, and then the residential and other smaller customers in the poor communities then pay less if you base it on their cost. Those are the two kinds of subsidies. As NERSA, we only have the mandate over the electricity prices, and therefore can only deal with cross subsidies, that is the subsidies within the tariff. But other subsidies like your free basic electricity, that is a national government subsidy, which even now it is paid by the National Treasury from Fiscus. We only assist it in administering that subsidy, but we don't make decisions on that subsidy. It is made by the government as to the amount of electricity that people get, right, and how much National Treasury allows to municipalities and Eskom in terms of that subsidy.
Gentlemen, let's leave it there. Many thanks to my panelists, should I call it that, the Organization of Undoing Tax Abuse, CEO Wayne Duvenage, via Skype, energy expert, MD at EE Publishers, Chris Yellend. Always good to have you on the show. And on the phone, Brian Sechotlho, who is the acting executive manager for electricity over at NERSA.